back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Hey, welcome back to The Law Show. I'm Zach Spencer here on CL 650. Today we are talking about the anatomy of a brain injury. Joe Murphy, lawyer, partner at MurphyBattista in Vancouver. And our special guest today is the secretary of the BC Brain Injury Association, Liz Barron. Now, this is Super Bowl Sunday. Now, we have had so much in the news and in entertainment talking about brain injury. Concussion, the movie just recently came out. Football, obviously, is probably the highest, looks like the highest impact sport. It might not be. Rugby players would probably differ. But is this helping, do you think, the traumatic brain injury discussion? Is sports helping to lead that for the average person on the street?
I think sports is giving us another profile. I think it's only a piece of our population. I mean, we know that brain injury is the number one killer and disabler of children and adults in BC currently, and sports...
Say that again. It's what?
The number one killer and disabler of children and adults under the age of 45.
Really?
Yeah. And in BC alone, between 21 and 38 individuals sustain a brain injury every day. So, as Joe was suggesting earlier, there's such a breadth of causes, and sports-induced concussions are certainly one of them. But I think one of the things that's tricky about brain injury is it's often an invisible problem. If people are able to walk, it's not perceptible, and it makes it harder to raise awareness about it. And so that's where I think sports-induced brain injuries are becoming a vehicle for us to increase awareness about brain injury, certainly. And
are you seeing this high-profile movie and football, obviously, all these stories of football players having, not great retirements, and some of them committing suicide because of brain injury? Is this helping to bring brain injury to the forefront?
Without a doubt, the public has a better understanding that you can have someone who's had some trauma and ends up with a brain injury that has ongoing problems. It used to be that people thought that can't happen if they weren't knocked out. If they didn't go to the hospital in a coma, then they couldn't have been hurt. But now when people, especially in Canada, watch a hockey game and watch a player collide with another player or the boards, and he slowly skates off, and we find out later he's off for a week or a month or months because of concussion, people understand it doesn't take much sometimes. You don't have to have your head hit per se for a person to have a concussion, and these concussions that can appear to be quite minor at the start can have huge impacts. Sidney Crosby off for a year following, last in a series of concussions. The whole world watched that and thought, is he ever coming back? So
and he hasn't really had the same... I mean, he's had, I think one really strong season since, but this season, he didn't even make the All-Star team. I think was shocking, but, he's not the player maybe he was before.
I would agree with that. I think, unfortunately, his whole team is struggling, even though it's just laden with stars. But, yeah, he's not the same. So he comes back, he looks the same, he talks the same, he walks the same, skates the same. But with a brain injury, your reaction time is slightly reduced. So if his reaction time before to something on the ice was 0.3 seconds, maybe now it's 0.5 seconds. And that may not be a difference for you or me functioning every day, but when you're an elite level athlete, that's what separates the best from the pack. The differences are so interesting. Liz is a speech and language pathologist, and when I first got involved in brain injury, I thought, why would we have a speech and language pathologist? They talk just fine. But it's not that. It's their ability to communicate. So after brain injury, you can talk the same, but your ability to communicate and your ability to understand what people are trying to communicate to you is different. And it leads to confusion and upset, sometimes anger, and it just can explode. All starting out with a communication problem. So they talk the same. That's why people with brain injuries...
So you're saying the processing behind what they're going to say is the difficult
part. What they're going to say and how they take what someone is saying to them. I've acted for a bunch of young kids with brain injuries, and the tragedy I've found over time is these kids as a result of the brain injury, never developed the social skills to make and keep friends. You know, can you imagine going through your whole life never having a good friend? What a tragedy. But I've had little kids injured who had that problem because they just could never learn how to make friends and how to keep them.
So, Liz, with a brain injury, and we want to clarify, we talk about concussions in the pro-level athlete. It's the same thing. I mean, a concussion isn't separate from a brain injury. It's just a type. Is that how you classify it?
That's correct. Yeah.
So, when you meet somebody after they've had their accident, you're working with them to kind of restore their next stage of their life, because they're often never going to go back to the way they were. How do you establish that baseline? Is that where you bring in a spouse or a brother or sister or a parent to find out, you know, what you're dealing with? Because you're meeting them with the brain injury. You didn't know them before that. So does the family help with that? Family
certainly does help. We always try to get collateral, because I think a big part of rehab and recovery is understanding who the person was before the injury. So we'll talk to family or friends, you know, to get as much of a picture of that. It's a challenge for folks recovering from a brain injury, because in many cases they want to go back to interests or hobbies or sports that they did before, and it can be quite challenging to do that. So it's a bit of a balance, I think, of understanding their pre-morbid or before injury personality, and then looking at what's realistic after the fact. But as Joe was saying, with kids, I mean, certainly with adults, the effects of brain injury on someone's social skills and social communication can be absolutely devastating. We see a lot of folks lose friends, a lot of broken marriages, family in many cases pulls back, and these people are left very, very isolated while being quite impaired at the same time. And so it becomes a bit of a downward spiral for a lot of our clients. So one of the things that we really try to emphasize, and I think part of the mission at BC Brain Injury Association, is wanting to create a community at large where we're helping to improve understanding and awareness of brain injuries so that there's a greater tolerance in our society at large, but also because we need to help rebuild social capital around these folks. It's not, even if you have all the money in the world, if you only have paid people around you who are around you because they're paid to be there, that's not really social capital. You want to help these folks in their rehab and recovery to build social relationships. But the other side of that is improving education and awareness in our community about brain injuries, so that there's kind of a
today,
two-way.
I hope. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think these kinds of shows are really important for that. And certainly on our website, which is brainstreams.ca, we've got a lot of great information and education for the public to be a part of making that easier for folks with brain injury in our community.
Now, Joe, you mentioned that you speak to the family members as well, because you need to kind of get a baseline of what this person was like before. Now, somebody who's 40 years old, married, 2 kids, has a certain lifestyle, you can help determine kind of what their path would have been at that point. But as you mentioned earlier, with a child, it's totally different, because you don't know what they're going to become. So you can have all the input you can with parents, but nobody has a crystal ball. So how do you help them in that case?
If I have a client, and I've had a number in the past, injured as a child, brain injured as a child, who appears to have ongoing problems. And I say that because the great majority of these people fully recover. That's the good news. We're talking 85 to 90% fully recover. They go back to normal life. So that's the good news. But if I have one who's continuing to have problems, I will literally wait till they're 18, 19, 20 before the case is finished. And I had one case that was, I think, 14 years from start to finish, because I just had to wait. And this was a young girl injured. She was injured at the age of 4 in a head-on collision. We waited till she was 18 or 19. Through school, she was always a top student. She was always on the honor roll. And it was only when she finished school that we realized, in putting her into job settings, that the best job she could do was a cleaning lady, provided she went to the same houses every week.
Do you need a routine?
She needed routine. You couldn't bring about any change. And she, in spite of being bright, in spite of being in the honor roll, she couldn't problem solve. And that's one of the things that concussion does. It robs you of the ability to problem solve. So IQ is usually not reduced by a brain injury.
Really?
So your IQ is the same, but your ability to use
Some would argue that's not the case with me, but
I had one client who had a brain injury, needed a surgery, a craniotomy, a terrible brain injury, and his post-injury IQ was 142.
Wow.
Geniuses are thought to start at 140. He was at 142. And again, when he got better, we thought, okay, let's sort of transition him back to work. He was an executive. And we didn't get past volunteer work, which he couldn't do because he just couldn't juggle the routine and planning of doing part-time volunteer work. It was overwhelming to him.
Never mind running a business or something.
Oh, and he was devastated because this guy was a really bright executive who was climbing in a large corporation. He was dynamic. And when you meet him and talk to him, you believe he's still that person, and he still carries his old business cards.
So do you see that the one part of the brain wants to do it and knows that they used to be able to do it, and the other part of the brain, I'm putting words in your mouth, but is that the way it works, that the other part of the brain is holding them back?
I think it's a variety of parts of the brain at play.
I'm just using that as an example, but elements of your personality.
For sure. I think one of the things that can be really affected in many brain injuries is insight. So a person's awareness of what is realistic for them to be able to do or what their difficulties might be in doing certain things. So if their insight is reduced to their own difficulties, then they often think they can just do what they did before without issues. So again, I think a big piece of that rehab is helping them understand what's challenging for them. And
Zach, I want to explain something, because if I have a client who comes in with a knee injury, they know better than anyone else what's wrong with their knee. But if I have a new client comes in with a brain injury, I expect that they will, when I ask them, how are you doing? They'll say, oh, I'm fine. And I always have them come in with someone else, and I watch that someone else for their reaction. And I had one fellow who came in to see me. He was about 50 years old. He came in with his wife, and she phoned me before the appointment and said, I just wanted you to know that I won't be able to say anything when I come in with my husband. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, if I start talking about problems he's having, he flies into a rage. And I said, was he like that before? And she said, well, of course not. Mm-hmm. So he had no insight, but also his frustration level and his anger level took so little to just trigger. And this is how the guy was different. But if you ask him at the meeting, how are you doing? The answer is, I'm doing fine. I'm doing okay.
We are going to get into the advances in treatment, rehab that is required for brain injury. When we continue our conversation, we're talking about the anatomy of brain injury with Joe Murphy, QC, lawyer and partner at MurphyBattista in downtown Vancouver. Liz Barron from the BC Brain Injury Association is the secretary here, giving us all the expert insight, I should say. And we'll be back next on The Law Show on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.